Blackwood, England. Population, just under 20,000. A quiet working-class town. The kind of place where families lock their doors at night and neighbors nod on the street. But in 2003, that silence shattered. It began with the Harlan family. A brutal crime that left an entire household dead. At first, people thought it was an isolated tragedy. But then, another family was slaughtered. And then another. Parents, children, no one spared. Each crime scene told a story. Each killing more disturbing than the last. Whoever was doing this wasn't just killing. They were sending a message. Over 2 years, 5 families were murdered in Blackwood. The police called it a nightmare. The press gave it a name. The Crimson Shadow. This is not just the story of a killer. It is the story of a town trapped in fear, of investigators chasing shadows, and of a truth far darker than anyone imagined. Blackwood, a small, working-class town in the heart of England. On the surface, it was ordinary. Rows of brick houses, children playing football in the park, neighbors who knew each other's names. For generations, Blackwood had been a place of routine. Safe, predictable, forgettable. Until the winter of 2003, when everything changed. The first family was the Harlans. Michael Harlan, 42 years old, a factory supervisor. His wife, Claire, 39, a school teacher. 2 children, Sophie, aged 11, and Daniel, just 7. They were the picture of normal, the kind of family everyone in town thought they knew. On a freezing December morning, their neighbor grew concerned. The curtains hadn't opened. The car hadn't moved. No one answered the door. What police found inside would stain the town forever. The scene was chaos. Furniture overturned. Family photographs smashed. Michael and Claire tied to chairs, their faces bruised and blooded. Upstairs, Sophie and Daniel lay in their beds, their throats cut as if someone had stood over them in the dark, watching them sleep. But what disturbed detectives most wasn't just the brutality. It was what was missing. Every mirror in the house had been removed. From the hallway, the bedroom, even the bathroom. Gone. Taken as if the killer wanted to erase any reflection of himself, or of them. The Harlan murders ripped through Blackwood like a storm. This was not London. Not Manchester. This was a small town where people left their doors unlocked. Suddenly, trust evaporated. Who could do something like this? And why take the mirrors? Some whispered about satanic rituals. Others, about a serial killer practicing his craft. For the detectives, it was their worst nightmare. A family annihilation with no leads, no fingerprints, no DNA. Just silence. For months, the case went cold. Parents walked their children to school. Shopkeepers locked their doors before sunset. At night, streets were empty. Blackwood had turned into a town under siege. People prayed the Harlans were an isolated tragedy, that lightning would not strike twice. They were wrong. 6 months later, in June 2004, it happened again. This time the Patel family. Ravi Patel, his wife Meera, and their 3 children. They were found in their home on Oak Street. This time, there was no blood, no knives. Instead, they had been suffocated, their mouths taped shut, their nostrils pinched closed. One by one, life smothered out of them. And once again, the killer left a signature. Every mirror in the house gone, removed with precision, as if taken as trophies. But this scene carried another horror. The bodies had been arranged around the dining table. Ravi at the head, Meera beside him. Their children seated carefully in chairs, their heads slumped, their faces pale, their eyes closed. It looked like a family meal frozen in time, only the silence was unbearable. Whoever staged it had taken their time. Whoever did this wanted it seen. When word spread, panic consumed Blackwood. Parents refused to let their children play outside. Locks and alarms sold out at hardware stores. Families slept with lights on, clutching baseball bats and kitchen knives. And through it all, one question hung in the air. Who was the Crimson Shadow? Was it a stranger passing through? Or was the killer living among them, blending in, nodding politely on the street as though nothing had happened? Police poured resources into the case. They checked known offenders, interviewed neighbors, traced the Patel's last days. But again, the killer left nothing behind. No fingerprints, no forced entry, no DNA. Whoever it was had studied their victims, planned every move, and vanished without a trace. By now, detectives began to suspect a pattern. Both families lived within 5 miles of each other. Both included young children. Both homes had their mirrors taken. This wasn't random. It was deliberate, methodical. A predator was choosing families, stalking them, and then wiping them out. And so, the town of Blackwood began to change. People stopped trusting their neighbors. Rumors spread about suspicious cars, strangers walking the streets. Teachers noticed their students were quieter, sleep-deprived. Even the local church sermons turned grim, warning of evil walking among them. Everyone was waiting, wondering who would be next. For detectives, one thing was certain. This was not over. The Crimson Shadow had struck twice, and he wasn't done. By the summer of 2004, Blackwood was no longer the quiet town it once was. 2 families gone, entire households erased, and yet, no answers, no arrests, no justice. The murders of the Harlans and the Patels didn't just terrify the town, they rewrote its very identity. Blackwood was no longer a safe haven, it was a hunting ground. Detectives began combing through both cases side by side. The Harlans and the Patels had no obvious connections, different ethnic backgrounds, different jobs, different social circles. Yet there were chilling similarities. Both families lived within a 5-mile radius. Both had young children. Both homes showed no sign of forced entry. And in both cases, every mirror had been taken, as if the killer couldn't stand to leave them behind. The mirrors became an obsession for investigators. What did they mean? Were they trophies, ritual objects, or symbols of something darker? Criminal psychologists speculated the killer couldn't face his own reflection. Or perhaps he believed the mirrors trapped the souls of his victims. Whatever the explanation, one thing was clear. The removal was deliberate. It wasn't random. It was his signature. As police tried to make sense of it, the community grew restless. Parents refused to let their children walk to school alone. Teenagers who once roamed the streets stayed inside. Hardware stores couldn't keep locks, chains, and security lights on the shelves. And still, late at night, cars would stop suddenly on quiet streets. Strangers were seen lingering outside windows. In Blackwood, fear itself had become a disease. In November 2004, the Crimson Shadow struck again. This time, the Wilsons, a blended family of 5. James Wilson, his partner Laura, her teenage daughter, and 2 younger boys. Neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual. But when Laura failed to show up for work, colleagues called police. Inside, the scene was grotesque. The family had been bludgeoned with a blunt object. The force of the strike suggested rage, yet the staging of the bodies suggested patience. As before, the mirrors were missing. Every single one. This third killing confirmed what many had feared. The Shadow wasn't going to stop. He was escalating. He was refining his work. And he was taunting the police with every scene he left behind. Detectives began analyzing the timeline. 6 months between the Harlans and Patels. 5 months before the Wilsons. The killings were coming faster. And if the pace continued, it was only a matter of time before another family vanished. Asterisk, then came the letters. In early 2005, a local newspaper in Blackwood received an anonymous envelope. Inside was a handwritten note in block capitals. They were not pure. I cleansed them. You cannot stop what is justified. The letter was signed with the crimson handprint. Forensic teams tested the ink. No fingerprints. No usable DNA. Whoever had written it was careful, methodical, and arrogant. Asterisk. More letters followed. Each one darker than the last. Biblical verses twisted into threats. Ramblings about sign, family, and purity. Detectives began to realize this wasn't just about killing. The Crimson Shadow believed he was on some twisted mission. A crusade against families he deemed unworthy. In March 2005, the Edwards family became his 4th victims. This time, the staging was even more disturbing. The parents and 2 teenage daughters were placed in the living room, each seated upright with their eyes covered by cloth. On the coffee table lay a single Bible, open to a passage about judgment. Once again, every mirror was gone. Once again, the killer vanished into the night. By now, Blackwood was paralyzed. Families moved away. Schools reported record absences. Shops closed early, some permanently. Local police were flooded with calls about suspicious figures, strange cars, shadows in the dark. But almost every lead went nowhere. It felt as if the killer was everywhere, and nowhere. The Crimson Shadow had murdered for families, for households gone. And yet, he was still out there, watching, waiting, planning. Detectives knew they were running out of time. Because one thing was certain, the Shadow would kill again. And the next strike could come any night. By spring of 2005, Blackwood was collapsing under the weight of fear. For families gone, entire households erased. The police had almost nothing to show for 2 years of investigation. But then, a name surfaced, a man the community already whispered about. Edward Crane, 38 years old. a carpenter by trade, a loner by choice. He lived on the edge of town, in a sagging cottage surrounded by overgrown hedges. On the surface, he was ordinary, quiet, forgettable. But behind closed doors, his past was darker than anyone realized. Crane had spent time in psychiatric hospitals in his 20s. Former neighbors remembered violent outbursts, strange rituals in his backyard, and an obsession with mirrors. Children recalled how he'd stand at the edge of the park, watching them play, saying nothing, just staring. When detectives dug deeper, the coincidences multiplied. Crane's workshop was less than 2 miles from 3 of the crime scenes. His delivery routes as a carpenter matched locations where the murders had occurred. And one chilling detail: months before the Harlan murders, Crane had been spotted in their neighborhood, offering cheap home repairs door to door. The police brought him in. He was calm, polite, almost too cooperative. He denied everything. His alibi was airtight. On the night of one of the murders, he'd been at a friend's house. Another night, he was working on a client's kitchen. Each alibi checked out. Every lead dissolved. It was maddening. But detectives couldn't shake the feeling. Crane fit the profile too well. His history, his proximity, his obsession with mirrors. Still, without physical evidence, he walked free. And Blackwood remained a town in terror. Then came the 5th murders. The Harrisons, a young couple, their teenage daughter, and their infant son, found in May of 2005. The scene was the most horrifying yet. The parents strangled, the teenage daughter stabbed, the infant smothered in his crib, and, once again, the mirrors, gone. But this time, something new, a message scrawled in crimson paint on the wall. It read simply, "I see what you see." For detectives, the signature was undeniable. The crimson shadow had struck again, and Edward Crane was once again in the spotlight. Neighbors swore they'd seen him near the Harrison Street in the weeks before the murders. But when confronted, Crane smiled. He offered receipts, timestamps, witnesses. Once again, the evidence evaporated. He was slippery, careful, almost as if he wanted to be caught, but never could be. And then, the letters escalated. Handwritten pages mailed to newspapers, ranting about purity, sin, and cleansing families of corruption. The handwriting bore a striking resemblance to Crane's, but forensic experts were divided. Was it him? Or was the real killer framing him? By now, the town was unraveling. Residents formed neighborhood patrols. Vigilantes whispered about taking matters into their own hands. And through it all, Crane continued living quietly, working with wood, blending into the background. But detectives were convinced, if Edward Crane wasn't the Crimson Shadow, then he was hiding something just as dark. For investigators, the question wasn't just whether Crane was guilty. The question was whether they could stop the shadow before he killed again. By the summer of 2005, Blackwood was suffocating under the weight of fear. 5 families gone. Entire households annihilated. The police had a suspect, Edward Crane, but no evidence strong enough to hold him. The community whispered his name, but in the eyes of the law, he was still a free man. And with each passing month, everyone knew the Crimson Shadow would strike again. Detectives decided to take a risk. They placed Crane under near-constant surveillance. His phone tapped, his mail intercepted, and marked cars parked at the end of his street. For weeks, nothing. He went to work. He came home. He drank tea on his porch. It was as if he were daring the police to prove something they couldn't. But then, one night in late August, they got their first break. At 2:13 in the morning, Crane made a phone call. His voice was low, muttering, almost incoherent. The recording captured him saying, "They're all clean now. They don't suffer anymore. But they'll never understand me." It was enough to chill even the most hardened detectives. Finally, a glimpse into the mind of the shadow. With this, police moved in harder. A covert team followed Crane everywhere. They noticed peculiar habits. He'd stop outside houses with large families, lingering just long enough to make notes in a small leather book. He bought rope. He bought paint. He purchased cheap mirrors from thrift shops, only to smash them in his yard late at night. It was behavior too specific to ignore. In October, detectives got a warrant for his home and workshop. Inside, what they found erased any doubt. Hidden beneath floorboards were journals, stacks of them, each one filled with ramblings about families, purity, and reflections. Drawings of houses with windows marked in red. Sketches of dining tables with bodies arranged around them. And in the margins, one phrase repeated over and over, "I cleanse what is broken." But the journals weren't the only discovery. In a locked cabinet, investigators found boxes containing trophies, a child's shoe, a broken watch, a silver locket with a family photograph still inside. And most damning of all, fragments of mirrors wrapped carefully in cloth. The Crimson Shadow's calling card. Forensic testing revealed fibers in the boxes matched bindings used in at least 2 of the murders. At last, after 2 years of bloodshed, police had their suspect dead to rights. The question now wasn't if Crane was the Crimson Shadow, but whether he was working alone. When confronted with the evidence, Crane was eerily calm. He smirked. He denied everything. He told detectives, "I'm a carpenter. I build. I don't destroy." But as investigators laid out his journals and trophies, his silence grew longer and colder. In November 2005, Edward Crane was formally arrested. For Blackwood, relief washed through the town like sunlight after a storm. Parents breathed again. Children returned to school. For the first time in 2 years, people dared to hope the nightmare was over. But they were wrong. Because even with Crane behind bars, the killings weren't finished. In early 2006, Edward Crane walked into London's Central Criminal Court, shackled, expressionless, the eyes of a nation fixed on him. For 2 years, the Crimson Shadow had terrorized Blackwood. Now, the alleged monster was finally on trial. Prosecutors laid out their case with precision. The journals, the trophies, the fibers linking him to bindings, the surveillance tapes, the chilling late-night phone call where Crane muttered about cleansing families. Each piece pointed to one man. The jury listened in silence as crime scene photos flashed across the courtroom. Parents strangled, children silenced, mirrors missing. One by one, the pattern was undeniable. And yet, Crane himself remained unmoved. He sat still, occasionally smirking as the evidence was read aloud. At times, he scribbled in a notebook. At others, he stared at the jury as if studying them, as if daring them to see what he saw. The defense argued the case was circumstantial. No fingerprints, no direct DNA, just assumptions, patterns, and paranoia. They suggested someone else could have planted the journals, that the trophies were collected junk, that the Crimson Shadow was still out there, framing an easy target. But for the families of the victims, there was no question. They wanted justice. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned its verdict, guilty. Edward Crane was convicted on 14 counts of murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the first time, the town of Blackwood could breathe. The nightmare, it seemed, was over. But then, it wasn't, because just months after Crane's conviction, another family was found dead on the outskirts of Blackwood. The scene was horrifyingly familiar. Parents, children, mirrors, gone, and scrawled on the wall in crimson paint, "You never caught me." Police scrambled. How could this be? Was Crane innocent? Was he only one part of something bigger? Or was there another Crimson Shadow still walking free? To this day, those questions haunt investigators. Edward Crane remains in prison, never confessing, never denying. Some say he was the sole killer. Others believe the real Crimson Shadow, or shadows, are still out there. What is certain is this: 5 families are gone. Blackwood will never be the same. And the shadow of those crimes still lingers, long after the trials ended. The Crimson Shadow wasn't just one man. It was a terror that infected a town, shattered families, and left scars that may never heal. And as long as questions remain, the nightmare of Blackwood will never truly end.